Okay, chapter 14. Backseat. Bingo with my classy chassis. Let's get it on. From baby boom to modern plague. Only a few years after the end of the war, former soldiers and their growing families were using the GI Bill to buy cookie-cutter homes in new suburbs like Levittown, New York. By 1948, Californians could take a drive to eat their first McDonald's hamburger. Soon after, Americans were tuning into Ed Sullivan's variety show on their more than 15 million television sets, while anyone could enjoy a vacation across country, staying in that new cabin in that new chain of motor hotels called the Holiday Inn. Thought it said cabin, it said new chain of motor hotels called the Holiday Inn. Women were back at home, trading in their uniforms and overalls for feminine dresses and perfectly coiffured hair, while magazine and television ads sent the message that to be a real woman, she had to cater to her husband and family. After all, what could be more important than experimenting with over 100 jello recipes? It did not take long for Rosie the Riveter to become a distant memory. The Britain in the Britain the picture in Britain the picture was not much different. The brave women of war became mums and wives once again. And after so many years of deprivation, the American model of consumerism and label consciousness was quickly adopted. The sale of cars exploded, as did that of most manufactured goods. Young men and women also enjoyed Coke, along with the lessening of class restraints, which meant a lot more social mobility. The war had dealt the final blow to the old social order. In spite of the public objectification of women as household icons and perfect mothers, and Lucy and Desi sleeping in separate beds, Americans were not as chaste as they had so often been portrayed in potted histories of the 1950s. While many may have been cocooning in an attempt to be normal again, the post war period was actually a sexy era. Marilyn Monroe was strutting her stuff on screen and off. She was the first to pose for the cover of Hugh Hefner's new magazine, Playboy, and Elvis the Pelvis was gyrating his way into young women's hearts while he introduced a brand new, often controversial music genre. Rock and roll was here to stay. It is perhaps the novel, however, that documents the discrepancies in the sexual mores of the time. Peyton Place, with everything from adultery to premarital sex, was the most read book of the decade and revealed that age old hypocrisy, the clash between public chastity versus sex in the real world. The truth about American lifestyles was also documented in the controversial Kinsey Report, which literally proved men and women were enjoying sex a lot. Statistically, American women of the 50s had sex far more often than women of the 21st century. The same held true for Britons who were studied in the Little Kinsey Report, the difference being they remained more restrained in their public behaviors and sex stayed behind closed doors. In the medical community, there were some well known names who spoke out about sexual repression as an unhealthful condition. Famous psychiatrists like Carl Rogers and Eric Fromm warned that ignoring the libido was dangerous, and what people needed to do was relax and accept their very human drives and impulses, which would in turn lead to happier, healthier lives. This message was even carried by the conservative Norman Vincent Peale, who warned about the dangers of repressing sexual appetites. America's favorite pediatrician, Dr. Spock, got into the act when he assured worried parents that when their young children masturbated, it was nothing to become alarmed over. Legally speaking, the antiquated Comstock statutes that remained in a handful of states continued to fade away. Only Massachusetts and Connecticut retained laws that limited where and how condoms and other birth control devices could be sold, although more than 30 states prohibited retailers from advertising their products as birth control. By 1955, thousands of medical personnel were receiving formal training on best practice in family planning at the many Planned Parenthood clinics that continue to pop up around the country. In fact, as new conflicts were appearing all over the world, as the Cold War and the Korean War began, and as the French were being defeated in Vietnam, condom manufacturers were doing very well indeed. The FDA's successes as much of an irritant, as much as an irritant as the FDA had been to the condom industry, the big manufacturers owed that agency a large debt of gratitude. Without government interference, the condom would have remained a fairly primitive instrument, never moving beyond the bad old days of pesky holes and questionable quality. By the 50s, though, standardization had paid off. Manufacturers were able to meet increasingly stringent requirements, which, along with the fast paced growth of retail chains, enhanced sales. Suburbanization meant Americans were spreading across the country, and where there were new suburbs, there were bigger and better retail chains right behind. Drugstores popped up everywhere, and the chain stores were not shy about putting up colorful displays selling an increasing variety of rubbers. Along with this increased visibility came new kinds of marketing strategies. With easier access, pilferage became a problem, and chain stores had to devise new ways of displaying their goods, making sure not to put too many packages out at a time. Stealing condoms in quantity had become quite the thing, especially with teenage boys. Prior to 1957, the same year, the English brand Durex introduced lubricated sheaths. American import laws relaxed, and for the first time, foreign made condoms could be sold on the US market. The British were the first to take advantage of that change by bringing lubricated condoms onto the American market, soon to be copied by their US counterparts. Though the British had gone far to produce comfortable and disposable condoms, it was still possible to buy the ever durable, meant to be reused Paragon long after the war. By all reports, one had to be a paragon to put up with the thick, inflexible device just for the sake of saving a few shillings. But the comfortable life of the humble little condom was about to change again, beginning with the reemergence of an old ally and sometimes friend. Margaret Sanger, America's birth control icon, was a fragile little old lady in her 70s when she returned to the birth control fold, making her last and, some might argue, biggest impact on American sexuality, realizing her lifelong dream of putting birth control solely in the hands of women. Enter the pill. A magic little pill. Although her efforts on behalf of women to allow them to take control over their own bodies had led to the slow but steady erosion of the Comstock Act, Sanger was never completely satisfied with the way things had gone. Although she had given her tacit support for the use of condoms, the complaint about putting all the power in the hands of men had never gone away, and the scientific community considered research on birth control a taboo. This left the free market to simply continue to produce variations on the same theme: messy topical creams, cumbersome diaphragms, and primitive IUDs, many of which were not only uncomfortable but could be dangerous to a woman's health. There was also a significant rise in backstreet abortions during the 1950s, another compelling reason for Sanger's continued angst over reliable birth control. Even in her senior years, she longed for a better way. She found it quite by accident. In a casual conversation at a dinner party, Sanger aired her complaints to a young biologist named Gregory Pincus. She lamented the lack of safe and reliable birth control for women, especially for poor and minority women, and those with physical or mental limitations. Sanger remained convinced that somehow, somewhere, there must be a way to create a magic little pill that would put birth control in the hands of women and make it safe and effective at the same time. She was ecstatic when Pincus told her that he believed there was a possibility that women's hormones could actually be chemically manipulated in order to prevent conception. That was all the still feisty feminist needed. Although the story of the early years of the pill R&D is a complicated one, the bottom line was that the dinner conversation between history's most determined birth control advocate and a little known scientist led to the most important scientific inquiry and result in the history of human reproduction. The pill's early years were reminiscent of the history of the condom. It, too, inspired many of the same arguments about the morality of birth control, as well as some new ones, like using drugs to manipulate women's bodies was unnatural and akin to playing God. To be able to pop a pill and voila, protection, made it too easy for the unmarried to get away with having sex without consequences, and even a very angry response from the NAACP groups who accused the Planned Parenthood organization and its clinics of providing birth control pills in order to intentionally limit black birth rates. And the Pope weighed in again. In 1964, Pope VI, often called one of history's more progressive popes, was making an effort to modernize the church and its policies. Perhaps surprisingly, by the church's own count, there were many clergymen, at least 75%, who embraced the pill, believing it to be an excellent method of birth control. But through its Papal Commission of Population, the Family and Natality, fondly dubbed the Birth Control Commission, the Church stubbornly refused to recognize any kind of birth control for married couples except the rhythm method, otherwise known as Catholic or Vatican roulette. That was it. Papal edicts or not, though, the significant percentage of Catholic women embraced the pill. Usage grew from approximately 25% of American Catholics at the time the Birth Control Commission was meeting to 80% by 1980. The pill also had its ups and downs with the FDA. In 1966, the same year Margaret Sanger died, the industry had its wings clipped briefly when the government agency told companies like T.R.L that they would have to commit to long-term studies for the new varieties being developed than had previously been required. Side effects had become an issue, but this did not slow down sales or research. In fact, the pill was so popular that President Eisenhower was asked at a press conference whether or not the federal government would be supporting birth control research. His embarrassed reply was that it is not a proper political government activity or function or responsibility, and it is not our business. Only a few years later, however, in his State of the Union address of January 4th, 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson, cautiously announced his plans to promote the use of birth control abroad. I will seek new ways, he told Congress, to use our knowledge to help deal with the explosion in world population and the growing scarcity in world resources. This statement of support for birth control was not a bold one, but it was the first ever by a sitting president. Johnson was sure that by merely alluding to federal financing of contraception, he might anger Catholic voters across the country. He was not to know just how many Catholic women were already quietly on the pill. By the mid 1970s, domestically, the federal government was helping to fund more than 2,000 public health clinics, all of which provided poor women with the pill as other countries adopted its use. By the mid 1980s, more than 80% of the world's sexually active women under 50 years of age had taken the pill. How about that sexual revolution? From the time that the Beatles made their debut in America and the plans were being made to put a man on the moon, the growing movement toward a lasting change in regard to the Western world's sexual mores eclipsed into a remarkable period of extreme sexual liberation, most spectacular among white urban and middle class youth. Miniskirts, love beads, tie dye, and rock and roll became icons for a new and provocative attitude towards sex. Cities like San Francisco, Amsterdam, New York, and London became city centers for a generation dedicated to free love, ushering in a period of open sexuality even the ancient Greeks would have been proud of. This heady mix of the pill and free love has led to the historical dismissal of the condom as an anachronism by the 60s. Sales dropped, the and has been the standard footnote. But that casual disregard of a device that had been in use for thousands of years could not be further from the truth, because though the pill greatly enhanced the newfound sexual freedoms of the younger generation, the good old standby did not just go away. Some months after the pill made its public debut in 1960, condom sales did begin to feel the impact, but it was certainly not a dead letter. True to its long and tumultuous history, it found its way into the public eye in a number of interesting places throughout the 60s and into the 70s, just before the British invasion of America, which turned the post war England copies in the US trend around. Beatle Paul McCartney made the news when he was arrested in Hamburg, Germany, during an early Beatles tour. He had hung up a condom in a public place and literally set fire to it. Paul thought it was funny, but the German police did not agree, inviting him to leave the country. In popular fiction and film, the smash English novel, and later a TV show, A Kind of Loving, featured Victor, embarrassed to be discovered buying a pack of three, still the magic number in packaging. As late as 1971, a condom loomed large in the movie Carnal Knowledge. Then the seamy side of Clarice's character emerged in Looking for Mr. Goodbar. When she let the faceless man she just picked up know just what she thought of his suggestion that they practice safe sex. Instead of being grateful for the precaution, she blew up the proffered condom before she blew up the proffered condom before handing it back. In Steps, Jerzy Kosinski's dark fiction about the Soviet Union, the author used the condom to help his tortured narrator heap silent scorn on the communist system by having him pin condoms on the chests of hated apparatchiks. 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 It's a crazy word. APPARATCHIKS. You try and enunciate that. But through all this, what was the rubber's role during the sexual revolution? Between 1955 and 1965, approximately 42% of Americans of reproductive age used condoms as birth control. It is only within the Jewish and African American communities that usage had dropped by just under 10% by 1965. The pill did not change or challenge these numbers until the 1970s, and then only briefly. The United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, the story is similar. Between the years 1950 and 1960, 60% of married Britons preferred male methods of contraception. Sheath. The pill had outstripped the condom by 1970. From 1966 to 1970, 38% of married couples and sexually active singles used the pill versus 31% using the condom. But perhaps somewhat surprisingly, single women still prefer that men take the initiative. This jives with the statistical information from pharmaceutical sales, which showed a much greater comfort zone among women when it came to buying condoms. Interestingly, American women also proved themselves to be more comfortable than men when it came to picking up a pack of Trojans. The solid status of the condom as first, then second choice is perhaps even more intriguing given the state of advertising by the end of the 1950s. American television and radio were officially banned from advertising condoms or any other form of birth control by the National Association of Broadcasters, NAB. The ban remained in place throughout the 1970s. The first commercial to buck that prohibition was aired in California, where in 1975 a Trojan commercial was shown on KNTV. Viewers overwhelmingly approved of the ad, but the station did not like the national attention it drew and yanked it despite its popularity. This weird media netherworld was reflected in an article titled In the Shadows, printed in a 1963 edit of Time magazine's business section. In the words of the unknown author, in the ranks of U.S. business thrives a shadow industry whose presence is largely ignored by businessmen and talked about only discreetly by its managers. Time told its readers that though the contraceptive industry was more or less underground, it was growing at an astounding rate, with domestic condom sales going past the $85 million mark this year. That year. The figure is not correct. Sales remain steady at about $200 million a year in spite of the pill. But it does reflect a certain ignorance or possibly just naivete on the part of the media, since there was nothing particularly underground about the sale of condoms at the time, nor was it an up and coming industry, but rather one that had been at the pinnacle of Wall Street for many years. Perhaps the most or only accurate part of the article was its assertion that manufacturers were counting on an increase in sales, figuring that they had tapped only 20% of the potential birth control market. They were sure that with the huge wave of baby boom teens now coming of age, there was nowhere to go but up. That hope for increased market share was realized beginning in 1967 when there was a huge increase in demand. But what neither time nor the manufacturers would have been able to predict was what drove that market surge. Because of the Agency for International Development's AID push with presidential support toward the great task of solving the world population crisis. By the mid 60s, countries like India, through grants from the United States, were buying 50 million condoms a year from the United States and at least 22 million from Japanese manufacturers. By 1970, India was also producing more than 270 million a year. This new and seemingly endless market opened up quite suddenly when the AID reversed earlier hands off policies governing birth control and international aid. In fact, American officials were so determined to get Indian men to wear them that, as one AID officer put it, we want the condom to be as well advertised as Coca Cola. This was just the beginning of a many decade push to offer billions of freely distributed NIRODHSs throughout the third world. Nahrods, Nahrod, Nahrods, Nahrods. Post war Europe. What happened to the Gummis? Like previous eras, after the war, those countries that had once been the centers of condom commerce saw a flip flop in not only usage but sexual mores, and the laws codifying them, like the pro birth movement in France after World War One. Fears of a shrinking population once again led many to believe that condoms were a danger to the very existence of France. The pro natalist movement was back, but this time it proved to be much more powerful than before. Similar to the extreme feminization of women's roles in the United States and the United Kingdom, French women were expected to go home and stay there, helpful to fulfill General de Gaulle's 1945 demand of women to have environ 12 millions de bébés pour la France. 12 million bouncing babies for France in the space of 10 years. Or le baby boom. Abortion was a crime punishable by death, and birth control was illegal, a fact that did not change until 1967. As with other extreme movements, there were those who chose to ignore the bans, obtaining foreign made condoms through the black market, but it did make life very difficult for many French couples who simply could not afford too many mouths to feed in an economy racked by war. The picture was somewhat different in Italy, where, in spite of the looming presence of the church, there was a very active and public birth control movement that began in the mid 50s. In 1956, the Italian Association for Demographic Education, AIED, was founded with the aim of defending the idea and practice of limiting the number of children a couple decided to have, and specifically of combating the existing legislation against birth control. The AIED had an interesting collection of supporters, all secular, including the socialists and the communists, but its proposals were strongly opposed by the Catholics, who outnumbered the others and managed to uphold all anti condom legislation. Although the laws against birth control remained on the books until 1971, when they were declared unconstitutional, condom use was quite common by the end of the 60s and had been quietly practiced long before them. And even abortion became legal and easily available during that decade, in spite of the church's loud and very public opposition. Perhaps surprisingly, it is in Germany where the Gummi and birth control in general suffered the greatest suppression after the war. Hitler's strange notions about human sexuality, as it turned out, had left quite a mark on that country. The new German Republic's government seemed determined in the 1950s to legislate all that it regarded as relating to public and private morality. Although the immediate period after the war was dubbed a time of extreme erotic liberality, that soon changed. Censorship became the norm, and any kind of dissemination of birth control information was strictly prohibited. Like the early Nazi era, access to condoms, in spite of protests, was not completely cut off, though there were those who tried hard to prevent their sales, just as in the war years. Fear of disease or the handy exploitation of that fear had kept them on the market. But while vending machines had been fairly common on many German streetscapes, as well as in public toilets and at the back of bars and barbershops, from the mid 1950s to the early 1960s, there were heated debates among jurists and journalists over the desirability of these machines. The argument against them was that even the neutral display of condoms in vending machines could be interpreted, and some courts did, as an offense to citoyen on a stand, morals and decency. This vague but effective traditional legal category was often employed by conservative jurists in their efforts to deter youth and, by default, adult access to birth control. And like in Italy, Catholic activists set the terms of the conversation. In 1951 and 1952, conservative Catholic youth organizations burned down kiosks that marked pornography, and in 1953 they initiated actions against condom vending machines. Far from being legally censored, this inspired more street activism, or more accurately, rioting against condom machines. As the decade progressed, it is not surprising that fewer and fewer young Germans knew much about the private matter of sex, and specifically of birth control, ushering in another era of sexual confusion and ambivalence. But then came along Germany's answer to Margaret Sanger. During World War II, Captain Beat UHSE Captain Beat was the only female pilot in the Luftwaffe. Her husband, also a pilot, was killed in action in 1944, leaving her with a baby to raise and a shaky career as a pilot on the losing side. But it was her skill as a pilot that probably saved her and her son's life when she commandeered a plane and flew them out of Berlin just ahead of advancing Russian forces. She ended up in England, where she was briefly imprisoned and then allowed to return to Germany a few years later. Upon her arrival home, Beat was stunned to see the unhappy returned soldiers and their wives with no access to birth control, no money, and too many children to care for. The sexually regressive politics of the times were too much for her, and she was determined to do something about it. Beat, whose mother had been one of Germany's first women doctors and had taught her daughter a great deal about birth control, even though such knowledge was not allowed during the Nazi regime, challenged not only the social norms of the time, but also the law. She made a quiet deal with a rubber manufacturer and sold the condoms he made for her, along with birth control advice booklets she wrote herself, door to door. Later, she began a mail order business selling not only condoms and birth control advice, but sex toys as well. Well, years later, Beat was one of Germany's greatest sex entrepreneurs, in spite of years of legal battles she had had to fight, and with only one exception. She had always won. By the 1990s, the former pilot owned a chain of popular sex shops whose shares sold well on German stock exchange. When she died, she was not only worth the equivalent of almost $200 million. Beat was also a highly respected social activist and businesswoman. She was remembered fondly not only as a condom entrepreneur, but as the person who brought the once taboo subject of human sexuality back into the limelight. Sex, like eating and drinking, is one of mankind's basic needs. What about practical prophylaxis? By 1950, to the tune of $200 million worth a year, America's number one choice for birth control was the condom. But before the end of the 1950s, their use as disease preventative had all but gone away. Penicillin and other modern drug therapies had put to rest many age old health concerns, not the least of which was the dreaded scourge of syphilis. But it was also a period when prostitution was at an all time low in most Western countries. Many historians believe this was due to the post war drop in the average age of marriage and the quiet but steady lifting of the taboos against premarital sex. Either way, it seemed that fewer prostitutes meant less disease, but this is also a strange time in history to regard to sexual mores, attitudes, and the public versus private approach to sex. Again, because of federal government efforts to end VD once and for all, by 1948 there were only 70,000 Americans afflicted with a sexually transmitted disease, which was actually a remarkable feat given that just the American military alone had reported almost 400,000 cases by 1919. By 1957, the eradication effort had been so successful that there were fewer than 7,000 reported cases that year. Reminiscent of the arguments against the use of condoms and later the pill, there were government officials and doctors who believed that the stunning success of the public education efforts and wonder drugs that had helped make this drop possible was likely to lead to extreme promiscuity and the eventual demise of the family and society with it. But the success was lauded by most. And by the end of the 1950s, the once abundant funding for clinics and VD eradication programs had all but dried up. After all, syphilis was a thing of the past, right? Sadly, not quite. That's what usually happens when a disease control program reaches the point of near eradication. It's usually the program that's eradicated, not the disease. Dr. William Holder of the Mississippi Health Department. Even though it appeared that venereal diseases were near extinction, many US and UK public health officials tried to keep their education programs alive. History had proved how necessary it was to educate about the dangers of unprotected sex and how quickly venereal diseases could bounce back. But their message was drowned out by those who now found that message outmoded and downright unsavory. This was, after all, a time when there were few cases on record. Early marriage and monogamy were the cultural ideal, and when all else failed, drugs could cure all. Public will and willingness to spend tax dollars on prevention simply dried up. Then along came the sexual revolution. In the United States and the United Kingdom, planning family planning clinics, most of which received extensive public funding, were becoming increasingly common and very public about sex education and providing condoms for birth control. There was no suggestion that VD and birth control clinics be fused, combining both messages and getting the most mileage out of public money and condoms. Instead, by the early 60s, VD eradication programs had all but gone the way of the poodle skirt, and the shrinking educational effort was confined to the quietly growing number of free, privately funded clinics, which were fast becoming a necessity, and underfunded local health departments, where small staffs labored to deal with an exploding yet silent epidemic of venereal disease. And by the time an infected person ended up in one of these facilities, curing, not preventing, was the message. The not so long term effect was absolute ignorance about the dangers of unprotected sex with the wrong partner. Practical prophylaxis was not even a distant memory for most, especially among the younger generation, which resulted in a venereal plague that rivaled anything the world had ever seen. The age of VD. By 1965, it was estimated that at least 650,000 Americans under 20 were contracting either syphilis or gonorrhea annually. Estimates for the over 20s varied, but the numbers were staggering. By 1969, states like Texas, Virginia, Nevada, Illinois, and Tennessee were reporting well over 300 people per 100,000 residents had gonorrhea. Georgia reported more than 500. Big cities were the hardest hit. Atlanta reported over 2,300 cases per 100,000. And the numbers in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and Newark were not much better. In LA alone, officials were sure that over 45,000 women had the disease and did not realize it. That year, there were a total of just under 450,000 cases of gonorrhea reported in the United States, and the number of unreported cases was probably much higher. In the case of syphilis, the numbers were not as bad, but it certainly had not gone away. It was similar in the UK, where the National Health Services increasingly found it difficult to keep up with a burgeoning number of new cases of not only syphilis and gonorrhea, but also what came to be known as the second generation of sexually transmitted diseases. And in the age of the feminist movement, women, for the first time in history, were as likely to be infected as men. A doctor who specialized in treating VD summed it all up when he said that the bugs aren't half as resistant to the drugs as patients are to instruction on prevention. Once again, history was to repeat itself, and nowhere did the mistakes of the past visit themselves more obviously than in the American military. Back to moral prophylaxis. After World War II, the American military, though though slow to after World War II, the American military, which though slow to catch on, had had a profound effect on bringing the condom into the disease prevention fold. Turned wholeheartedly to character education, with the Army experimenting on young recruits by requiring they attend classes on morality and religious instruction. Riveting lectures with titles like The Ten Commandments, A Purity in Thought, Word, and Deed, and Marriage as a Sacred Institution were delivered by chaplains across the country. Gone was the practical boys will be boys message that it was better to be safe than sorry. Though the most extreme religious messages never became an army wide requirement for all recruits, it was the model that influenced certain elements of military training all the way through the Vietnam War, with military officials again trying to make it all about the individual soldier's morality or lack thereof. Sex outside of marriage once again became an issue of misconduct, a punishable offense, and once again policy did not reflect practice. During and after the Korean War, a rich army in a poor nation meant there were Korean prostitutes on every corner, and the VD rate among soldiers hit historic highs. 8 out of 10 contracted gonorrhea at least once during the 12-month stint. Thanks to the wink, nod approach to prevention, there were still pros available. But like the general populace, many men were much less aware of sexual health than their World War II counterparts, and others just figured it was easily cured. This casual attitude meant that, in spite of free vending machines, and in the case of the Navy and merchant marine, large barrels on the gangplank overflowing with condoms so that sailors could grab a handful every time they went ashore. Disease was a given for the average American soldier serving in Korea. It remains a problem there today. The reality was that there was plenty of affordable sex for sale. Clumsy attempts at education were part and parcel of individual leaders' attempts to be practical, but there was no military wide program to help support the effort. Some commanding officers actually worked with troops as they headed off to Korea to inform their men about safe sex and the dangers they would face if they were sloppy about protection. But it was too little and often too late. The memory of one soldier's experience of sex ed in the field probably sums up the quality of the instruction. The whole company lined up one snowy morning with our hapless, trying to be serious top sergeant standing before us, with a broomstick stuck through his legs to an appropriate length and at an appropriate angle, demonstrating how to apply a condom. True, it was the second dumbest army movement in my career. Dumb or not, condoms did help lower the VD rate where crew training was conducted, but as the numbers continued to soar during and after the conflict throughout the 60s and into the 70s, official support of any such training efforts remained conspicuously absent. During the Vietnam War, the same problem persisted. One officer complained that it runs wild out there, referring to the hot and cold running prostitutes. This high ranking official added that suppression is our policy. If we can do it, suppression is best. Unfortunately, in some areas, we just can't do it. We have enough trouble regulating haircuts, let alone their sexual habits. The pros were available, the education was not. Combating the plague again. Oh, so true to the long and troubled history of the condom, advertising and public discussion of what by the early 1970s was a venereal disease pandemic demonstrates the moral, legal, and ethical struggles inherent in dealing with just how, when, where, and to whom, and if the message of safe sex and protection should be projected. In this radio and television radio and television continued to be conspicuously absent, which is true even today. In 1977, the puritanical leaders of the NAB met in San Diego to establish a committee to work with TV officials on what those leaders termed an effort to discuss what additional contributions broadcasters can make in addressing such important national health problems as warranted pregnancies and venereal diseases. As the New York Times put it, that's their way of saying they will discuss broadcast advertising for condoms. But it was not a very serious discussion, given that even by 1979, when the Justice Department had fought and won a battle to overturn the NAB's anti condom code, the change did little to encourage other broadcast media to begin advertising prophylaxis, in spite of the relaxed social sexual atmosphere left by the sexy 60s. It is perhaps telling that in a media environment in which one would surely expect to find this kind of advertising, it was actually limited to written publications, mostly men's magazines like Penthouse. When Julius Smith's company had approached Playboy in the mid 60s with ideas for low key promotion of its product as birth control in that popular magazine, even its editors refused any mention of condoms because they did not want to disturb the euphoria of its male readership. To its credit, by the end of the 60s, Playboy had turned around its anti condom advertising policy and begun accepting ads for the major brands, but only as birth control. Ebony and a few lesser known magazines followed suit, but the other media outlets did not. They remained standoffish when it came to advertising condoms for any purpose. And in spite of the soaring VD rates, until the 1970s, manufacturers continued to pursue advertisements for their products only as birth control. When it came to disease prevention, the good old days of pretty maids lounging on a package of widows, boldly labeled for prevention of disease, were over. No one wanted to demean their products by identifying with them with the growing sexual plague. But where the big boys left off, to their credit, some of the major magazines and newspapers like Time Magazine and the New York Times did an admirable job of attempting to bring public attention to the VD problem by running serious articles with titles like Venereal Disease, a National Emergency. No one could accuse these high end sources of trying to avoid publicizing the frightening scourge, but the average American remained uncomfortable with the message or simply did not read the articles. That, and just like the bad old days of epidemics gone by, grassroots efforts had proven time and again to be the only way to get the message to everyone. Those efforts would take a lot of time and money to resurrect. By 1970, there were entrepreneurs, educators, private organizations, nonprofits, and local health departments who recognized that the skyrocketing VD rates had to be addressed. A small not for profit called Population Services Inc., run out of a second floor office in North Carolina by British doctor T.R.L. Black and a former deputy director of CARE, Philip Harvey, a character who would loom large in condom history more than 2 decades later, exemplified this private effort to address a growing public menace. These men focused their attention on young college students, trying to help them understand just how simple and inexpensive condoms really were in protecting against disease. They advertised in thousands of college publications so that at least the students of Rutgers and Berkeley who bought condoms by the gross from PSI's mail order businesses, responding to catchy ads like, "What will you get her for Christmas? Pregnant?" got the dual message of birth control and safe sex. And students in small town colleges who knew about the catalog ordered their devices in private rather than making the embarrassing trip to the town's local drugstore. Retail anonymity meant safer sex. Given the fact that it was still illegal to send condoms through the mail, it was also risque. The old standby publication The old standby, public education, specifically in schools, was still being haggled over by the early 70s when it was suggested by leading experts that children as young as 12 should be taught the safe sex message. Some experts believe that a national program for mandatory testing for 40 million Americans would help officials end the problem. But that brought up the issue of cost. Public health advocates were doubtful that the national will the national public health advocates were doubtful that the national will to spend that much when gas prices loom large and the Vietnam War had done so much harm to the national psyche existed. In places like Sacramento, California, there were local attempts to promote condom use, while nationally, the National Commission on Venereal Disease was busy calling for a study on research into prophylactics and wide public education on the method. More than 50 years after the military had first been swamped with VD and the message of prevention had percolated through the public and private ranks. And 30 years after the put it on before you put it in motto had saved countless lives and a lot of public monies, it was back to studying up on whether condoms were helpful in preventing venereal disease. And the old argument about public health officials educating about the supplying condoms was a green light to illicit sex reared its head again. At a time when government and individuals could afford to retreat into fear and ignorance, it would seem that history would again repeat itself. The supposed open mindedness of the age of Aquarius apparently had its limits. In hopes of finding a blanket solution to the pandemic, in 1972, the Commission asked for $46 million to be spent in the next fiscal year in order to help find the cure to the modern plague. But little did they know that this was only the beginning. If only in the what ifs of history, it is tempting to consider just how different the world would be in the 21st century if what had been known for so many centuries had been embraced as common and consistent practice by the 20th century. If at some point the condom had finally been accepted as a practical and moral device instead of forever being batted about as some kind of whipping boy for the ups and downs of human sexuality or the perception of it, perhaps history's worst pandemic might never have happened. Sadly, though, no one could have predicted what the next and most dramatic surge of contagion would mean to the world.